Welcome to Issues and Challenges in Sterile Processing, a podcast conversation presented by Sterile Processing University. Today's episode is titled Travelers in SPD, a plus or a minus? I'm Jason Morosi, Senior Educator for Sterile Processing University.
And I'm Nancy Chobin, President of Sterile Processing University.
Well, good morning, Nancy.
Good morning, Jason.
Okay, so travelers
Interesting
today.
topic.
Yes. Again, the title plus or minus, it could be the best thing for you, or sometimes it's not necessarily the best thing.
True.
Travelers, I've had a lot of travelers, and I actually did traveling too, myself as a sterile processing and surgical tech. It can be very rewarding in the sense of, pay is one thing, but it's also nice when you're traveling because you are supposed to skip all the hospital politics and just go to work for 13
That
weeks.
don't happen.
Yes. So I would automatically, always suggest, to travelers, stay out of it because I would say 75% of the time they're there is because there's problems.
Well, we have to look at it from two perspectives, from the traveler's perspective and from the hospital's perspective or surgery center, whatever facility you're working in, because we all know that staffing today is an issue. And as we discussed in other episodes of podcasts, that ever since COVID, we lost so many people who left the field during COVID and didn't come back.
Uh-huh.
And it's hard to attract and retain new people. And yet, we have to provide the essential services to the patients.
Uh-huh.
So we have no choice now but to bring in travelers. And that presents a whole nother issue. First of all, it costs the facility almost twice as much as what it would cost for a regular sterile processing employee. And number two, it creates friction between the regular sterile processing staff and the travelers because they're going, they're making more money than me and they got special hours and they don't have to do this and they don't have to do that. Well, they're all issues we have to talk about. When you bring travelers in, do they know what the current practices are in your facility? And hopefully they're national standards. I have had companies bring in travelers and for specific purposes. In one facility, it was to process the laparoscopic instruments. And they brought their own detergents and they were doing their own thing. And when I did my audits and I said, excuse me, you can't use that detergent. You have to use the detergent that we're using. Oh, we use it every place. I don't care you use it every place. In our facility, you follow our policies.
Uh-huh.
I also found they were not compliant with national standards. They were putting covers on instruments that weren't validated for covers. So, my opinion, even when you get a traveler, first make sure that their certification is valid. You should be required that they are certified. And number two, do a short competency assessment. Are they familiar with the equipment you're using? Are they familiar with the practices that you have? Maybe you need to let them, if they're going to be working decontam before they start there, read your decontam policy.
Yep.
And then, whether they're travelers or not, you have to monitor their work until you have a confidence level that they can work independently. Because if you remember, Jason, at one of our hospitals where you worked, you had some travelers come in and they were telling the staff, oh, you don't have to do that. I worked at such and such hospital. We didn't do it there.
Yeah.
That creates chaos.
Absolutely. What's also too is you brought up, hospital or surgical center. It is amazing. Years ago, the thought of a traveler at a surgical center would never happen.
Yeah.
And it is now very valid. I know a lot. I personally know travelers that are getting assignments in surgical centers. And you're right. Competencies. Yes. You should. So with me, and I always got looked at very kind of crazy for thinking this, but I always gave my traveler, when I hired them, even if I was hiring them, now remember, travelers you hire usually 13 weeks.
15 weeks, yeah.
Yeah. So I would hire them knowing it would be just 13 weeks, but I would take that first week and I do full blown orientation. Even if they were a traveler for 3 to 11 or 11 to 7, I told them the first week was going to be 7 to 3 with me and my supervisor, where we could do a competency, get you working in watch, have somebody work with you in decontam for a day, have somebody work with you, on sterilizers or low temperature sterilizers. Then the next day, the next 2 or 3 days, work on trays so we can answer any questions, because you don't know what's in our sets.
Right.
Everybody calls something different.
Right.
And you're right, to go over, this is the chemicals we use, this is our practices. I think that is so important. And most people think they're professionals, come in and start working the minute you get there. And that is the biggest mistake.
Yeah, yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, what you're explaining is what people should be doing.
Yeah.
I don't see that. I see that they're so happy to have a set of hands come in that they just throw them to the wolves and say, okay, you're in decontam today. And that's really dangerous. I've always said the mother of, assumption is the mother of all screw ups. When you start assuming and you don't know, you can get into big trouble.
Uh-huh.
So don't assume that they know everything they're supposed to know. They may be certified, and you should certainly make sure that the company who is providing them to you has validated their certification, that it's current. But you have to make sure that they can do what you need to do. Now, I'll give you this example. At one of my hospitals, we had to get 2 travelers. And the first one came in, and I happened to be at the hospital that day, and I wanted to check her out, but I had to go to the operating room to meet with them. I said, while I'm there, would you wrap some basins? Because we were using reusable basins at the time. So I came back about a half hour later, and she was still wrapping the basins. And I see that she was taking the wrapper. And like when you make an Easter basket, she was taking all 4 corners up to the top and putting the tape around. And I looked at her and I said, what is this? And she said, well, you told me to wrap the basins. I said, that's how you wrap? And she just looked at me. I said, is this a joke? And she said, no, isn't that the way you wrap? I said, and you're asking me? You're supposed to be somebody we're paying to know what to do. I called the company and I said, I'm sending her back. And please don't send me anybody that doesn't know what they're doing. I'm not paying you. At that time, we were paying the company $33 an hour. I said, we're not paying you, and I have to teach people what to do. When they come here, their expectations is, at least the basic stuff. So you've got to be very careful, and that's why that competency assessment is so important.
Yeah, I can tell you right now, too, the techs themselves are getting like $33 to $36 an hour. So now you're paying like 70 something, 80 an hour for them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's funny you had brought up that story, because last month was Easter, and I had to do that Easter basket thing. That's a lot harder than doing the envelope fold.
I mean, sometimes I wonder, I say to myself, how do people even come up with these? I don't know. I mean, I couldn't imagine doing that. But
well, so here's the problem with staffing. So years ago, it used to be, we're getting a traveler on board. Years ago, it used to be minimum of 2 years experience, right? COVID happened, and they started taking people with just out of school, 3 months on the job training, 6 months on the job training. And that is now the traveling world, because they were so shortchanged, they had no choice. I mean, these companies wanted to provide people. They had to start taking people with the barest minimum experience, or pretty much none experience. And if you think about it, and I know this is a fact because I have a friend who was not certified, who was certified, but their certified lapsed, but still was traveling with no problem because so many states don't require.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
they were
mean,
able to get
if
it.
it's a reputable company, they know that that really is the national standard. So they usually require that they're certified. But that's why I said if you have people come in, you need to specify that, but it doesn't guarantee it. Now, I don't know if I shared this story with you at the time, Jason, but you and I were involved in a very large project a number of years ago. We had travelers that I
Mhm.
brought in, people who you knew and I knew. And on one occasion, they were working to recheck the work of the people who had done it for quality assurance. And one of the travelers was noted that he was not testing the laparoscopic instruments. And the traveler said something to him, and he said, "I don't have to do it. I've never done it." And he said, "No, you have to do it." And he said, "No, I'm not going to do it. I've never done it before. It takes too much time." He reported that to the supervisor who called the company, and he was terminated. So it's really important that you do monitor them. You know, they in this case he knew about it, but he just felt he didn't have to do it. Now,
Mm.
I'm not saying that this is true of all travelers, but this is why it's so important. Don't assume because you're bringing these people in that they know everything and they're going to do everything correctly. Because we know, you know, when a lot of times when people can't, they're not successful in a very structured environment, like in a hospital surgery center, they'll work for, a travel agency because they are given a little more liberties when they're at work and they get to go to different facilities. But you still have to really be aware when you bring contract people in, you are still responsible.
Yes.
And the example I can give you, because it happened to us, you hire a company to pick up your biohazard needles and syringes, okay? And they go down the road a couple miles, and the guy decides, I'm not bringing this to the facility. I got better things to do. And he dumps them in a park or something.
Mhm.
Now, eventually they get found and they go back to the company. But we hired the company. So we're just as much at fault. So when you hire these outside companies, you're not off the hook.
No.
People need to understand that you're not off the hook.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, and I'll be very honest with you, what you were just saying about that. Prior to COVID, yes, my opinion was 99% of the travelers were out there because they couldn't hack working in the hospital, and I mean maybe because of politics or it just didn't, having a steady workflow wasn't right for them, and it was usually not the best employee. A lot of times there were people that got terminated and
Yeah.
they couldn't find a job and they started traveling. But I have to say, in the last few years, especially in the places I worked with some really good travelers that were behind in education and learned from me.
Yeah.
Now, those travelers are having a hard time moving forward with their jobs because they're going to places that are doing everything wrong and
Yes.
they're trying to be helpful and they're being labeled as trouble.
Right.
You know?
That's a big issue, a very big issue. And it's still, today is still an issue.
Yeah. Because like I have one of a very good personal friend of mine who was traveling in the Midwest and African woman, African American woman, and was one had to deal with racism, but then because she went to the school of Nancy and Jason, she was just even had to deal with that. And then, when she was trying to present the right things to do, nobody wanted to listen, and I think she actually left the contract and something, she's in her, and more the end of her career and very professional. And I don't think ever left a contract like that. And recently I know she left one saying like, she's treated like garbage and trying to make sure the right thing is done for the patients and they don't want to hear it.
Yeah. And that is really unfortunate. And that's true whether you're a sterile processing employee of the facility or a traveler. We talked about this before where, employees who take the time to get educated, take one of our courses, get certified, and they get hired into a facility and they start seeing all these things wrong, especially in a surgery center, because there is a difference. I love the surgery centers, but we have to realize that the surgery centers that we knew 10, 15 years ago, when they did lumps and bumps and, TNAs and myringotomies and things like that, they're doing spines now. They're doing the same types of surgeries that we're doing in hospitals. And so when you have a technician get hired there, they're also told, no, we don't have to do that. The person who was here before set this up, and we don't have to do A, B, and C. And when they try to tell them, they're shut down. So you could have, an employee who's very well trained comes into a facility and they're shut down and they're told unequivocally, no, this is the way we're doing it. I don't care what you say. We don't have time to do it, because in a surgery center, depending on the size, but I would say the vast majority of them are smaller centers, have maybe 2-3 rooms. So they don't usually have a lead technician, and everything falls to the nursing director. Well, the nursing director usually does not have a sterile processing background. And so there's no meeting of the minds there. It's a little bit different in a hospital. Now, in a hospital, if you go to the manager as a technician or even a traveler and say, look, staff is doing this, and according to AAMI standards, we should be doing that, and they shut you down, then you only have one choice: to elevate it to infection prevention or risk management. A lot of the techs don't want to do that. They don't want to get involved. They're afraid of losing their job. So you have to really be diligent. Another facility I was at had a company that was doing all the endoscopic instrumentation. We had it at two of our facilities also. And so I was making rounds, and I went into the room where she was processing, and the water with the detergent had an orange color. And I looked at her and I said, why is the water orange? I don't know. After I do a couple things, it turns that color, but the detergent's still good. I said, how do you know that?
Yeah.
She said, well, and this was the standard at that time, but not really. The standard many years ago, up until SC79, was you change the solution when it looks dirty. Well, we learned when it looks dirty, it's way too late. You're now putting on way more microorganisms and you're taking off. But she wasn't updated. In SC79, it said you change your manual cleaning solution and or your sonic solution based on the types of surgery you're doing. You determine if it's going to be changed every use, every 3 uses, every 4 uses, and you put that in your policy. But she continued to use this. There was a pipe overhead that was part of the facility, but you're working there. All you had to do was look up at the clock that was there, which people usually watch the clock all day. There was at least 2 inches of dust on that pipe, and it was right over the sink where she was doing the cleaning. How could you not see this? So these are the type of things that, as a manager, you have to walk around, get out of your office and find out what people are doing.
Yeah.
Because you're responsible.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing too. When you bring a traveler in, and as the manager, your facility, if you're doing something not right or wrong, and or your challenges with administration to do something right. So you need to give the guidance and say, I have had travelers where I've said, listen, I know you're going to think we should do it this way, but I'm in the middle of discussions with OR leadership and administration. I'm trying to buy this. I'm trying to get that. Just bear with me. Do it like this. And as I'm working with the process, you have to be transparent. If you don't, if you're going to sit there and say everything is great and we follow the AAMI standards to the T, and everybody gets along so great, everybody's like family here, and your traveler gets there on their first day and everybody's treating them like garbage and nobody's following AAMI standards, then you got the traveler that doesn't want to be there, and guess what? They're not going to put their all into the next 13 weeks.
Well, I've also had experience, this was maybe about 10 years ago, and I don't know if it still happens, but I just, discuss it as for something to keep an eye out for, where some of the travelers become very, very, let's put buddy buddy with some of the surgeons.
Hmm.
And they will take their instruments and bring them down and personally process them, skipping steps if the surgeon needs them right away, just to keep the surgeon happy. And the problem with that is, A, it becomes a problem of standard of care for the patient, because the surgeon, he doesn't know. He's assuming he's doing everything okay, and he loves this person, or person, it's a woman, because they're doing everything they want, keeping him happy.
Hmm.
And next thing the company's contract is up, and we no longer can afford them. Well, now the surgeons are up in arms. No, 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 you have to keep them. You have to extend the contract. I can't do my cases if they're not here.
Yes.
And now it becomes a political issue.
Hmm.
So you have to be careful about that too. Yes, we need to get along with everybody. We need to have good relationships with everybody in the operating room, including the surgeons, but that does not include breaking the rules.
So some of the other issues is like also the travelers, you sometimes you have to exclude them from certain doctor trays because you've had such a uh, an issue like prior to them coming with bioburden and stuff, and you wind up just yourself excluding half of your staff from the trade. You're only letting one or two people do this because you've gotten pressure from the operating room director that says, I only want such and such persons touching these trays. This doctor's supposed to walk out here. And then the travelers get offended,
Yeah.
that they can't touch the trays. And it's like, you have to, like you said, you can't let them, go in there and take over the problems, because then if they take over the problems, then they're successful, then the doctors are not going to want them to leave. But then
Right.
also you have the same issue where they can become the problem. Like for example, we did an assignment many years ago. It was a consulting assignment, an education assignment, really, because I had a hands-on train everybody. And I remember sitting in the manager's office on this assignment saying, she's like, oh, I'm keeping all the count sheets to all the mistakes. So I said, well, can I have them? And I started to look at them. And now, mind you, we were there because they had no faith in their permanent staff because they were new. And they hired all these experienced travelers. And even one of them I knew from New Jersey. And um, they when I looked at the names, all the mistakes were the travelers. Their staff was making minimal mistakes, and the
Wow.
travelers were making the majority of the mistakes. So when we looked at that, that was just insane. So therefore, we had to incorporate the travelers into the training.
Wow.
You know, and there they were traveling, making top dollar, and getting the best education they could for free.
Yeah. And my advice to anybody out there who has a situation, which is probably about 90% of the facilities, where you don't have sufficient staffing and you're thinking about travelers, plan for the future. What I recommend is that if you have an OR educator, because most SPDs do not have a dedicated educator, which is a whole other issue. But if you have an OR educator, ask them if they would be willing, if the manager won't do it, because it really is the manager's responsibility, offer a sterile processing course at your facility. And you could do it off hours, you could do it during hours, however they want to do it. We did it at our facility. We had the course, we opened it up to anybody, because during the course we were able to see the good guys and made sure we offered them a job.
Uh-huh.
And we because it was done at our facility, we were able to give them the hands-on experience. Now that's not always possible. Some of these classes are at night and they're on their own, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just means what we did was, okay, we give up through decontam, you give them all the basics, the uh, microbiology, infection prevention, rules and regulations, and what have you. But after decontamination, we would say you need to go back to your facility and spend at least 2 weeks in decontam. At least so you can take the knowledge that you got from the book and look and see, yeah, here's the sonic cleaner, here's the washer, and what have you. And the same thing then after you did prep and packaging. You would go spend several weeks in packaging when it came to instruments. So by the time you completed the course, you had some experience as well as the foundation with all the information you need to do things correctly. Once you've done that, you now can hand pick the people that you want and keep them in your department and avoid having to bring in travelers. So you have to plan ahead. Don't wait for this to happen. If you go to administration and you could show them, this is what it's going to cost to bring in travelers. This is what it's going to cost to do a course. And you're going to see how much money you'll save. Now, we did write in that if they were our people that we already had hired, we would cover the cost for the training. However, they had to work for us for at least 2 years. Okay, so you have to protect yourself in that way. But people need to know the education is out there. Have your own course. And as I said, if the manager doesn't feel comfortable doing it, then see if the OR educator would do it. And then you're planning for the future and you can avoid a lot of costs. That's where we should be going. People are not even thinking about it.
Well, so it's very interesting you brought that up. So 2 years ago, I was in a position where we had to do that course. And the crazy thing about it was, even though we were going to hire, I think 5 or 6 people, I was so short-staffed, I still had to get 5 travelers plus put the people in the course at the same time.
Wow.
Because I didn't, and it got improved by administration because I did not have the staff.
Right.
I could not get anybody. Well, they were trying, like, even before I got there, they were trying to get staff for like a good year and a half. So we literally had to hire travelers for every open position and then also fill every other position with people who had no training. It was, matter of fact, they only opened it to inside candidates. So my choices were housekeeping and kitchen, and that was all that really applied for it. Nobody else really applied. And I'll tell you, just when they were getting on their feet, because they did the course and then we started training them, as soon as we got them on their feet and the travelers started to leave, the staff started to leave. Even though they all signed contracts, they still left. One person realized they wanted to be a police officer. One other person decided to go traveling. It's just insane. Sterile processing, I think, also has to there's a lot of sterile processing that has to get fixed, because the average employees nowadays are going in so short term, getting in and getting out.
Yeah. Well, there's and I'm glad you brought that up, Jason, because it brings up a couple of issues. Number one, when you see that there's a large turnover in a department repeatedly, the first thing they do is point a finger to management. You must be doing something wrong. Well, employees always get an exit interview. And, sometimes they're honest and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they don't like the work and they didn't like what was going on in the department. And so they throw the manager under the bus. But when you have this repeatedly across the board, it usually comes down to salary. Now, hospitals base their salaries allegedly on hospitals in the area. And if they look and see, well, everybody else is paying $15 an hour, so that's what we're paying. Yeah, but what are they doing? What types of cases are they doing? Are they doing orthopedics? Are they doing spines? Are they doing total joints? Are they doing cardiovascular thoracic? Are they doing robotics? These are the most labor-intensive instruments out there and take a lot of time and a lot of attention to detail. And that's very stressful.
Yes.
And so that's issue number one. You can't, A tray is not a tray is not a tray. So don't look at how many cases they do. What was the sophistication of the cases that they're doing? And that's what you should base it on. Number two, do they have the adequate staffing?
Mhm.
Most sterile processing departments do not, because the managers don't know how to do productivity. And we talked about that in another podcast. And if people are interested in that, I think they should listen to that podcast we did on staffing, because
Yes.
that's critical. If you don't have enough people, no matter what you do, you're going to be in trouble. Your staff is going to be forced to taking shortcuts, and that's going to lead you further down the road to more problems. So, are our salaries commensurate with the work we are doing? And I can tell you, in most cases, they are pitiful,
Yes.
absolutely pitiful, because we have talked before that you could work in fast food and get $15 an hour. And in some states, and my state is considering it here, $25 an hour. Well, there goes the state.
Oh my God.
You're going to pay somebody $25 to cook a hamburger, and yet somebody who's preparing instruments to go in your brain or your heart or sterile part of your body, and you're giving them $15 an hour?
Yeah.
That shows a total misunderstanding of the importance of sterile processing. I always say to the committee, when you have to go for either staffing or you have to go and justify capital equipment, and I said, who do you think is going to clean this $1.5 million robot instruments that you've just purchased?
Uh-huh.
Not the person in dietary, not the person who's cleaning the floor, the person in sterile processing. And you have the most sophisticated equipment, and yet you're paying them $15 an hour. It doesn't make sense. You have to have the salary commensurate with the responsibility and the knowledge that they need to get the job done right. And some places are making headway. You know, we were able to do it in the system when I was there, but for the most part, it's still woefully inadequate.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with certification. So, mind you, there's only a handful of states that require certification, and the problem is that all the other states don't, and these people have and again, I was in the same boat, for 30 years, no college for 30 years, working in sterile processing, and we want to make a lot of money, and we want to make what the operating room staff make. But the truth of it is how far do you go with their pay when the requirement is just a high school education? And when you have operating staff, to be a surgical tech now, it is a 2 years associate degree minimum, and nursing now is a bachelor's. They won't even touch associate nursing in the operating room. So I think, like you said, like that's where certification really needs to play in, because you need a clinical ladder for these people.
Well, this is what we did in my system, because I mentioned about the productivity. We had a company come in, and based on what other hospitals were doing, we lost 8 people overnight in one of our major facilities, and it devastated them. And they don't look at the sophistication of the work being done. So, I'm all for education. I'm all for personal growth. But that is not going to help you learn how to clean, disinfect, package, and sterilize trays.
Correct.
If somebody is in the department and they want that, that's all well and good. But to deny a position because they don't have a degree, in my opinion, is ludicrous.
Uh-huh.
And I see people that are hiring people with degrees that have no background at all.
Correct.
Oh, they're going to be supervisors. How can you supervise when you don't know what you're supposed to be supervising?
Uh-huh.
It doesn't make sense. So we have to do something about the certification. I agree with you. And we have to do something about the salaries. But the salaries have to be based on the sophistication of the work that's being done there.
Yep. That's why I'm saying that, I would love for it to be more money. But you're right. Like you have to have certain certifications in that job to make that money, because
Well,
you can't just
yeah.
give it to somebody that just started with no certification.
Well, that's what we did when we lost all those positions. I developed a white paper and we created a career ladder.
Uh-huh.
And we talked about this. If you're a technician and you really love your job, and at some point you'd like to get into management, I have to either die or leave before they have a choice in applying for my job. So you have to give people an opportunity to grow in their position. So we created a career ladder where the entry level position was actually paid a little bit less because they're coming in with no experience. If they have no experience, they started at that level.
Uh-huh.
Once they completed their training and passed their competencies in all areas of the training, they were promoted to a technician. Once they achieved certification, they were able to use that title and got $1 an hour more.
Uh-huh.
After that, they could assume while they were certified or not, but we preferred the certified people, they could assume what we call quasi-management, where they would provide supervisory coverage on weekends, holidays, and off shifts. Because I'm a firm believer that because we produce medical devices, we should have 24/7 accountability.
Uh-huh.
Because otherwise you come in the morning and say, Jason, why weren't these trays in? I don't know. Not my job. You've got to have that accountability. So if you can't afford to have a lead technician on each shift, then you could assign lead pay and people would volunteer for it. And they would get, I think it was $2 an hour extra to assume lead duties. They couldn't hire, they couldn't fire, they couldn't discipline. They were to expedite the work, make sure it got done, complete our end of shift report, and provide any issues to the manager so they could follow up on them. And then after that, there was the supervisor and there was the manager. So that career ladder was extremely successful. It elevated the salaries of everybody in the department because we based it on, if we do this and we can keep our people, this is what it costs to train people. This is, new people that we'd have to bring in. This is what it costs to do the career ladder. And we saved over almost $500,000 by doing that. Wow. So you've got to be creative and you've got to do your homework. You can't just go into administration and say, you got to give my people a raise. They'll say, yeah, why? Do your homework and they're just going to throw you out. You've got 15 minutes to present your case. Even doctors will tell you that. Don't come in here and waste my time. They want the quick and dirty. So you have 15 minutes to present your case. They want statistics. They want facts. They want, where did you get that information from? And if you could show them that, you will be successful. Because I have not ever had anything turned down. Sometimes it was delayed because it wasn't in capital. And they said they would expedite it to put it in the capital. I even had instances where they went into the contingency fund because the requirement was so severe. So you do your homework, it'll happen, but people just don't take the time to do it.
Yeah. And I tell you, it's very funny what you were saying about before about the degrees not having any weight. And it's so funny because, I recently, after 30 years of working without one, just got one. And in that school time, there was nothing I learned to help me with my sterile processing job. Nothing.
I went to nursing school and got an associate's degree. And we had a 2-week rotation to the operating room. One day they showed me a flash sterilizer. That was it.
Yeah.
And when I got hired as a nurse, this is interesting. My first job, I was on a med surg floor and we had a utility room. This is back 60 years ago. Okay. So the left side was the dirty side. The right side was the clean side. So back then we didn't have all these single-use devices. So if you did a catheterization or they did suture removal or small procedures, it went on the dirty side. And when you got a chance, you put on your gloves, no PPE or anything back then, okay? Put on your gloves and you cleaned it on the dirty side. And then with the same gloves, you brought it over to the clean side, put on clean gloves, and you would wrap it in muslin. We didn't use chemical indicators back then.
Mhm.
I don't remember what kind of tape we had on the outside. I think we did have chemical indicator tape. I'm not sure. And we had a little tabletop sterilizer.
Mm.
And we shoved it in and we sterilized it. So we thought, and that was it. And that was my extent of sterilization.
Mhm.
Didn't know
Wow.
what we were doing. Just told me what to do, and we followed it. Never questioned it. And that's not even done today.
Mhm. No,
So
and I can tell you, well, in nursing school, they don't get any sterile processing, and they're
uh,
lucky to get 1 day in the operating room. That's it now. Um,
yeah,
so we were talking about pay, and this is a good, another part of the problem with the pay. Uh, when so what your staff versus the travelers. So when a traveler comes, 99% of the staff are really usually upset that they're coming in and they're making anywhere from 15 to double of what that person makes, $15 an
right.
hour more, double. And it causes a lot of animosity, especially for the permanent staff, and they have attitudes about it. But out of all, somebody who traveled, and I tried to I tell my staff this to kind of ease the working flow between them. You know, yes, they're making more money, but these people have to leave their family. They have to live, sometimes not in the greatest conditions. They have to have like hotels or, rent a room from some stranger that they don't know.
Yeah.
Uh, if they have mortgages at home, they have to pay the mortgage at home. They have to pay where they're living. It's not necessarily, sometimes people walking, traveling. I mean, I know travelers that were making phenomenal money that were broke paycheck to paycheck because they had to send everything home, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So it's very important to that, because there's a big turn. Years ago, when I was traveling, you got your pay, which was pretty decent, and you got an apartment, and they used to give you like a regular apartment. Traveling now, they give them they don't even want to offer them apartment ever since the Airbnb thing came up. So basically, they're saying you take this amount of money, and this is what you're going to get an hour, and it's you have to get your own housing now.
Wow.
And they have to, it's for them that struggles, because if they can't find something that's worth it, they have to, all their money goes to their housing. Now, sometimes, it's becoming a really big thing now. People are, and I've even told people to do this. People contact local hospitals and say, I have a room to rent. So if you're going to hire travelers, please,
Hmm,
have them contact me.
that's a good idea.
Yeah, there's quite a few people doing that. And I even, like I said, I worked with the one traveler. After being there for a year, we became very, very good friends. And I even, like, at one when she wind up happened to take 3 months. No, I'm sorry, she had to take a month off because of tax purposes, because she was there for a year.
Yeah.
And so she had to take a month off. She came back to do more contracts. And at that point, I said, well, I have a room, and it was a decent price for her, and it was a great thing for me. So so if they can find something like that, they're making in the money. But, it's one of those things, if you don't know, if you don't understand it, you shouldn't judge it. And I mean, but I understand also how frustrating it is to do the same job as somebody else and get paid a lot less. So it's a double-edged sword. You feel bad for the staff, but then there's sympathy for the travelers because they're not getting all that money.
Well, you made a couple of really important points, Jason. Number one, to mitigate a lot of the concern, you do sit down with the staff and tell them, look, we've tried. I've given you over. They're concerned they're going to lose their overtime. Well, their overtime to death. If you have people that are dragging their feet, working day in and day out, and of course now that overtime is not taxed, people
Uh-huh.
are even more willing to work the overtime. And I'm all in favor of that. But still, if they're making mistakes and you can see them coming into work and their eyes are all bloodshot, you know that they're exhausted. And they can't go on that way, because at some point they are going to start making errors, and it's going to make it bad for everybody. So they need to understand that you don't take this lightly, but we need to have the help to get through this crisis. And yes, they are going to be paying more, but unfortunately, we have no choice because we can't get people to accept the positions. Once we do that, and of course, if you have a plan, like I said, a course, then they will understand that and they'll buy into it. But they have to understand that this is a last resort that you're taking, because there is no other alternative. You can't find the people, or if you have people, by the time you get them where they're self-sufficient, you've already devastated the operating room schedule. That's the important thing. What is it going to take to get us back on track until we can resolve the staffing and training issues?
Yeah, and then staffing, like I said, I kind of, and I don't know if I was wrong or right. It was kind of what I did when I looked for travelers, because I knew there'd be 13 weeks. A lot of times I just tried to get ones that were willing to work into decontam, because, when you have 1,000 trays, how much are they going to learn in 13 weeks? Especially you take away a week from that. So I actually tried to utilize my travelers in just decontam if they were willing. If not, then yes, I had them go around. But I did find a lot of travelers in my time where they were like, "Oh, okay, I have no problem," and they, because I'm not a fan of hiring somebody for 13 weeks and putting them on weekends by themselves or on call. So when I hire a traveler, it's a certain shift Monday through Friday, and it's 13 weeks, and I take a week away for training. So I'm like, 12 weeks, you just got to do decontam. They're ecstatic because they just, put their music on and go in there and do their cleaning and left alone. Because you got ones that you got some people who travel because they like to be loners. And then you have some that are very social. So it's a mixture of who you get,
And the problem is, you don't get to interview these people like you would with a regular employee. It's whoever the company sends. So you have a relatively short amount of time to see if this person is going to fit in, because, every facility, whether you're a surgery center or a hospital, you have your own culture.
Yep.
And so culture in one hospital could be totally different from another culture. So as the manager, at least you should know, what is the culture, not only in your department, but in your facility? And is this person going to fit in? That's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, what you get nowadays is you get one phone call, and it's probably like 10 minutes. And then you have to make your decision, because there is so many people that are trying to travel that you really do get a flood of applicants. And you get like a 10-minute phone call, and you're like, well, I guess it's usually more depending on what your demands are for the facility, if that person is receptive, because they're like me, when I travel, and it was my choice, I didn't want any 3 to 11 or overnights. I only want a day shift. So I used to have people call me and say, well, this is going to be a 3 to 11 position. And I would say, well, I appreciate your time. I don't want to keep you on the phone much longer, because I'm only looking for a 7 to 3, And then there's people that travel that only want certain states, because like for me, this is where traveling can benefit. Early in my life, it's probably nothing now. People are a lot more in debt than I was back then, but I was $10,000 in debt. And I said, let me travel local. And I was able to stay with a relative, and I got the housing money and the, hourly money, and I paid off my debt in 6 months. So yes, you could do something like that. It works for you. But I've also traveled I was in Michigan, and I between my apartment and my, my bills, my salary was eaten up every week. I was eating McDonald's and macaroni and cheese every night.
Wow. But it's important for people to know that it's not all bells and whistles and roses.
No, it's such a, cut. It's so, like a cut, like two-edged sword, I guess what I'm trying to say. It could be so good and so bad. And then, and like I said, these people are, they don't have their family, they don't have their friends. It's always good to include them in any kind of, if you guys do after work activity. I know travelers are usually so game for that. When I was in Pennsylvania, actually the travelers and the staff, we used to go out all the time together. You can make it, even though you're there for a short time, you can make it a very good experience for both.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
So yeah, let's see what else. And then, long-term traveling, that's, there's some people that do get there, and they're like, I was in Palo Alto, California, probably 20 years ago, but I was a surgical tech. All the travelers there were like there for almost 2 years.
Wow.
Because they just, again, it's the bigger cities, like we were talking about, pay so bad that I don't know if they're ever going to get into travel. I mean, I remember this was surgical techs. Back then, a surgical tech went on apartment assistance because they didn't make enough money in the town of California.
Wow.
So they had to have, your permanent staff was getting, if you were a surgical tech, you weren't even making. So imagine a sterile processing tech had no, I don't know how they lived in, places like that.
I'm aware of a facility that post-COVID, 50% of their sterile processing staff has been travelers.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't been able to get it down because they just can't attract people. People just, they don't want to work in a hospital anymore.
I just took a phone call the other night from a place I worked 2 years ago. Almost, I would say 75%, they said, of people are now traveling that I worked with in that department.
Wow.
There's only a handful of people. And the funny thing about them, the girl was telling me that she's in South Carolina, and some of the people she used to work with are there with her.
Wow.
So
think of how much money it's costing that hospital. If they would offer a course, how much money they could save. I mean, people don't think outside the box.
I think it's a system that we know very well that don't make good choices.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Sometimes, that's the problem, is that, again, when, like you said, when you're talking to administration, you have to be really on ball because they don't understand. And if anybody knows anything about administration, numbers. That's all they know.
Of course.
Of
course.
You can't go in there and say, how difficult it is to wash a loaner tray, or they
don't care.
Yeah, they don't even care. To them,
they deal in numbers. That's why I said you have to get your facts together. Do you have your productivity? There's a show. If you have productivity and your staff is functioning over 100%, mm-hmm. in other words, your department is producing 100% of the work, 100% of the time, okay? Your staff is going to be exhausted. They're going to lose their morale, and they're going to wind up leaving, because you cannot continue at that pace without giving up. And that's why that productivity is so important. And you use those numbers and go in and say, look, this is how much I've spent in overtime. These are all the things that I've done to try and get the work done. We simply do not have enough people. Or if it's your equipment that should have been replaced 5 years ago, this is what we're paying for repairs. This is how many times we had to cancel cases. This is how many times we had to abort cycles. All of those things where you could show the impact on the operating room, because that's where the two of us work together. They produce the money, but we produce the tools they need to produce the money. So if you don't have the tools, you're not going to make the money. It's as simple as that. So if we can show what we're doing and how it's impossible to produce the money, then they've got to pay attention to it. That's they understand. And people need to understand, if you expect to make change, that's what you have to do. Yes, it takes time. Yes, you have to put numbers together, but that's your job. Your job is to fight for your department and get what you need.
Yeah, and it's funny, like if you're working with a tracking system, make sure that you have your travelers coming. Have them set up for when they come. I've seen travelers work off other people's badges for the first 3 or 4 days
Oh,
because they're not set up in the tracking system to get product or for productivity. Like, have it set up so that you're going to have the extra expense on your department. You got to make sure that you got the right productivity.
yeah. Well, that's I think we ought to do another podcast on tracking systems, Jason, because I've seen some things where, the trays will come into decontam and they'll scan all of them that, they came in. But if they don't have a process where that tray is scanned during every step of the process, you're assuming that that person cleaned all of those trays. So maybe they did one. What else did they do while they were in there? Okay. Also, you've lost your productivity.
Uh-huh.
But I think we need to do one on tracking systems. I really do, because there's a lot of issues. One hospital had put in a tracking system. This was maybe 15 years ago. It was very early on. Very few hospitals had them. And when I go on site for consulting, I make sure I visit all 3 shifts. So the only shift I hadn't visited was the midnight shift. So I got to the hospital 5 o'clock in the morning. We had made arrangements with security to let me in. And I went down to the department and there's nobody there.
Mm-hmm.
And I assumed, that the person was in the operating room, maybe bringing things up there. And I'm waiting. It's now 6:30. It's 6:45. What the heck is going on? So I start walking through into the sterile storage area, and I'm deliberately making noise, looking to see if, maybe somebody was back there and they didn't realize that I was there. Still don't see anybody. So I go back into the prep area, and I was going to call the OR director, because at this point it's going near 7 o'clock, to say what's going on here and find out if the person was up there. And the person walks in with the hair all disheveled, eyes just about open. She had been sleeping. Worst part is when I checked I didn't say anything. When we checked the records after she left, she had scanned all these trays that she had processed, and none of them were done.
Oh, no.
So, we talked about this on other podcasts. That's considered falsification. That's considered cheating, and you could be dismissed for that. And she was.
Uh-huh.
So we've got to do one on tracking systems, because they're wonderful to have, but people need to understand, like anything else, if you don't use them appropriately, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap this up here. As the title, said, travelers a plus or a minus. And again, it's not either. It's neither, I should say. It's how the facility and the traveler work together. That's how it's going to be successful. If one side doesn't work, it's just going to, it's going to be a bad 13 weeks for both sides. So,
and an expensive experience. We have to remember the cost that's associated. So we have to try and make it work. I mean, I think that the whole idea of travelers is wonderful, because it does help facilities that are really in a bind.
Yep.
But on the other end, if it's going to cause more problems for you, then you're paying for trouble, which nobody wants to do. So if we need to have them, then we need to make sure that not only is the traveler successful, but our department is successful as well.
Yep. Couldn't say it better. All right, Nance. I'd like to thank the listeners. Please subscribe, leave comments. If there's any topics you want to discuss, let us know.
Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this.
To receive your free CEU approved by the CBS SPD and HSPA, go to www.spdceus.com. Watch the entire podcast on the Sterile Processing University page, and then after that, you will receive a free 1-hour CEU. Thank you.
there is not a boy I know who wouldn't want to date her. She is the